The valley still echoed with chaos. Midian had broken apart beneath the terror of the night. Trumpets had sounded through darkness. Torches had burned across the hillsides. Men had awakened to confusion, swords flashing wildly in panic while fear spread faster than commands could travel. The Lord had broken Midian exactly as he promised, but victory had not brought rest. Gideon and the 300 pursued what remained of Midian eastward through the wilderness. Dust rose beneath exhausted feet. The heat of the day pressed against their backs, while cold winds moved across the desert at night. The men staggered now, lips cracked from thirst. Sandals wore thin against stone. Some leaned on weapons simply to keep moving. The triumph of the night had become the ache of the road. The men who had stood with torches now walked with grit in their teeth and hunger tightening their bodies. Victory did not make the wilderness gentle. It only gave them another reason to keep moving. But Gideon refused to stop. 2 kings of Midian still fled ahead of them, Zebah and Zalmunna. Gideon's eyes stayed fixed eastward. He had lived too long beneath Midian's shadow to allow the kings to escape back into the wilderness. Every empty field, every hidden cave, every fearful season inside Israel seemed to press him forward. This pursuit was no longer only war, it had become personal. Gideon came to Succoth exhausted. The 300 behind him no longer looked like victorious warriors. They looked worn down by pursuit and wilderness. Hunger hollowed their strength, yet Gideon kept pushing them forward. The city had bread. Its people had walls, elders, stored grain, and the small comforts that weary men could smell before they ever reached the gate. For Gideon's men, even a loaf would have felt like mercy from the Lord's own hand. The king still fled ahead. Gideon approached the leaders of Succoth while his men waited behind him in silence. Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted. The men of Succoth looked past him toward the wilderness, toward Midian. They saw exhausted Israelites in front of them and uncaptured kings somewhere beyond them. Their eyes measured risk, their mouths shaped caution, their hearts listened for the safest side to stand on. Fear still ruled them more than faith. Gideon had won a great victory, but Israel still measured safety by visible power. What if Midian returned? What if Gideon failed before the pursuit ended? The leaders answered with caution, but mockery soon revealed itself beneath their caution. Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand that we should give bread to your army? The words settled heavily over the weary men standing behind Gideon. Israel doubted while Midian still fled. It was a bitter thing to stand among your own people and be refused mercy. Gideon had watched the Lord scatter Midian with torches and trumpets, but the fear inside Israel did not disappear in a single night. The cities still calculated. Leaders still protected themselves. Men still waited to see who would be safest to honor. The battle had moved from the valley into the hearts of the people. Gideon felt anger rise sharply inside him. Exhaustion fed it. Hunger sharpened it. Years beneath Midian's cruelty deepened it. Anger is not always simple in the stories of the judges. Sometimes it rises beside justice. Sometimes it carries the memory of real wounds. But in a weary man, even righteous concern can gather other things into itself. Humiliation, impatience, vengeance, the need to make others feel the weight he has been carrying. He answered with hard words. When the Lord gave Zebah and Zalmunna into his hand, he would return and flail their flesh with the thorns of the wilderness. Then Gideon turned away. Hungry men followed him back into the wilderness while the city behind them remained silent. He pressed on to Penuel. The request was the same: bread for exhausted men. The road between the cities did not soften Gideon. The sun kept burning. The men kept stumbling. Each refusal made the pursuit feel heavier, not only because their bodies needed food, but because their own people had chosen calculation over covenant mercy. But Penuel answered like Succoth. Fear had made them cautious, and caution had made them cruel. They would not strengthen Gideon while Zebah and Zalmunna still breathed. Gideon's patience thinned. He had fought Midian in the valley. He had chased kings into the wilderness. Now he was contending with the unbelief of his own people, while his men staggered behind him, hungry and worn. His answer grew harder. When he returned in peace, he would tear down their tower. There is a kind of weariness that exposes what has been forming quietly in a man. Gideon was still pursuing the enemies of Israel, but something sharper had entered his voice. The deliverer was becoming dangerous. The hand God had strengthened for Israel's freedom was now making threats against Israel's towns. The story does not let us look away from that tension. The pursuit continued. Gideon found the Midianite camp at Karkor. What remained of the enemy believed themselves safe now. The chase had stretched deep into the wilderness. The battle should have been over. Their camp would not have carried the same confidence as before. The vast host had been shattered. What remained was smaller, anxious, trying to breathe after terror. But men who escape judgment often mistake distance for safety. But Gideon attacked. The kings fled. Gideon pursued them until Zebah and Zalmunna were captured. The fear that had ruled Israel for years now stood trembling before the man who once hid wheat in a winepress. It was a reversal almost too sharp to hold. The kings who had moved across Israel like a shadow now stood in the open. Their flight had ended. Their names, once heavy with dread, were reduced to two men breathing desert air beneath Gideon's gaze. Gideon looked at the kings carefully. Their garments still carried the dignity of rulers, but the strength behind them was gone. The desert wind moved between them. Then Gideon asked them a strange question. "Where are the men whom you killed at Tabor?" The kings answered slowly. The men had resembled Gideon, each one like the son of a king. Gideon lowered his eyes. His brothers. For a moment the wilderness seemed quieter. He saw more than kings standing before him. He saw men of his own mother who would never return. The war had carried another wound beneath it all along. Gideon's voice became quieter. If they had spared his brothers, he would not kill them. Then he turned to his young son Jether and told him to rise and kill them. But Jether did not move. His hand did not reach for the sword. Fear held him in place. Gideon saw it, the same fear that once trembled in his own hands beneath the winepress. The boy's youth stood exposed before kings, soldiers, and his father. The command was too heavy for him. The sword was more than metal in that moment. It was the weight of blood, honor, vengeance, and manhood pressed into a young hand before he was ready to bear it. So Gideon finished it himself. The kings fell into the dust. Midian's power was broken at last. The death of Zebah and Zalmunna closed one wound, but it did not heal the nation. Israel had been delivered from the hand of Midian, yet the people still did not know how to live free under the rule of the Lord. A foreign enemy can be defeated in a day. A drifting heart requires deeper mercy. Israel saw Gideon differently after that. The fearful man from the winepress had become the deliverer of the nation. Midian had fallen beneath his leadership. Peace finally returned to the land after years of terror. The people remembered the night of the torches. They remembered the panic of Midian. They remembered Gideon pursuing kings when others refused even to give bread. To them, Gideon now looked like strength they could touch. That is what fear often wants after deliverance. Not the invisible rule of the Lord, but something visible enough to point at. A name, a house, a son after him, a throne, even if no one was willing to call it one yet. So the men of Israel came with an offer. Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also. The request carried something deeper than gratitude. Israel wanted security they could see, a ruler, a dynasty, a visible throne strong enough to keep fear away. Gideon had become exactly what frightened people often desire after deliverance, a man strong enough to trust instead of God. The temptation was subtle. He could have taken the crown without calling it a crown. He could have let gratitude become authority. He could have allowed the people's relief to become his throne. Gideon answered correctly, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." It was true. Israel did not need another human ruler to save them. They needed the Lord. But a man can speak the right words and still walk toward danger. That is part of what makes this ending so heavy. Gideon's confession was right, but his next request began to gather the materials of a snare. He refused a throne with his mouth while reaching for the gold of victory with his hands. The danger was no longer obvious like Midianite tents in the valley. It was quieter than that. Gideon asked the people for gold from the spoil of Midian. Earrings, chains, ornaments taken from defeated kings. The people gave willingly, and gold began piling before Gideon in glittering heaps beneath the sunlight. The weight of Midian's wealth now rested in Israel's hands. Gold has a sound when it gathers, small pieces striking other pieces, the soft clatter of tribute, the bright evidence that the enemy had been broken, and Israel now held what once adorned the oppressor. In another man's hands, it might have looked like testimony. In Gideon's hands, it began to look like danger. Gideon took the gold and fashioned an ephod from it in Ophrah. Perhaps he believed it would honor the Lord. Perhaps he believed it would remind Israel of their deliverance. Perhaps he never imagined danger could grow slowly through something meant for remembrance. That is how compromise often becomes persuasive. It does not always feel like rebellion at first. Sometimes it carries the language of gratitude. Sometimes it stands near the memory of a real mercy. Sometimes it borrows holiness from a past moment until people stop asking whether the Lord commanded it. But compromise rarely arrives announcing itself. It grows quietly, patiently. The ephod stood in Ophrah. People gathered around it. Hearts drifted toward it. The thing Gideon created slowly became a snare. At first, perhaps people came with gratitude, then with curiosity, then with expectation. A path can form slowly toward the wrong thing. Feet wear it down before the heart admits where it has been going. Years earlier, Gideon had torn down Baal's altar beneath the cover of darkness. Now another dangerous thing stood in Israel because of him. Victory on the battlefield had not healed the deeper sickness within the people, nor within Gideon himself. The old altar had been obvious. It had a name. It stood in open rebellion against the Lord. This new danger was more subtle because it was connected to memory, victory, and a man the people admired. Israel did not have to call it idolatry for it to become idolatry. Their hearts moved toward it, and that movement was enough. What had begun as deliverance became another place of wandering. Gideon lived to old age. The land rested during his days. Midian no longer crossed through Israel like locusts consuming the harvest. The years of hiding had ended. Peace settled over the land for a time. Fields grew again. Families gathered grain without listening for the thunder of camels. Children who had been born after the battle may have known Midian only as a story told by older voices. Rest is a mercy, but rest can become dangerous when memory grows thin. But peace alone could not keep Israel faithful. Gideon eventually died and was buried in Ophrah, the city where the Lord first found him hiding in the winepress. The man who once feared Midian had become judge over Israel. Yet even Gideon's victories could not hold the hearts of the people forever. After his death, Israel quickly turned again toward the Baals. Altars returned. The cycle began again. Fear, idolatry, forgetfulness. Somewhere in Ophrah, the ephod still stood as a reminder of how easily the human heart drifts. Gideon had delivered Israel from Midian, but Gideon could not save Israel from itself. The tragedy is not that the Lord failed to save. The tragedy is that Israel could receive mercy and still return to the old paths. Deliverance had been real, but the need beneath deliverance remained. That sentence hangs over the whole account. The Lord used Gideon. The Lord delivered through Gideon. The Lord showed mercy to his people in a generation marked by fear and idolatry. But Gideon was still a judge, not the king Israel needed. He could break Midian's power, but he could not break the cycle lodged inside the people. The judges could win battles. They could tear down altars. They could lead armies and bring seasons of peace, but they could not make the people holy. They could not heal the human heart. Israel needed more than a judge. Israel needed a faithful, righteous, and holy king. Until that king came, the ache of judges would remain. Rescue followed by drift, mercy followed by forgetfulness, rest followed by another turning away again.